Rari. Yeah. This guy got 4 fingers for real.
What is good, YouTube, man? It's your boy Young Rari, bro. We back up in this thing with another one, man. Today we doing something a little bit different. We're going into something a little bit more spookier type shit. Today we're gonna be diving into some Mr. Ballin. I've been on who Mr. Ballin was. I done watched like his clips, but I ain't never like reacted to him. And it's always been like in passing type shit. You know what I'm saying? Where like I'll be watching him and like it's like I've always known he's had good content ultimately. You feel me? So this video here is gonna be called An Extremely Disturbing Camping Story. And I don't know what these contents are. I haven't watched the video yet, so we're gonna be getting our first time peeping it together. Another thing, like when I be on this is like my gaming, and also it turned into my reaction page also. It originally started as my gaming, and then I started posting reactions and everything, and it kind of just took off from there. So like I'll be posting like my gaming content more so in my shorts, and like the longer content, like you'll find it like in my, you know, like in my my video pages. Yeah, I might make a whole separate page for it, but right now I'm just cooking. I'm just having fun doing what I'm doing, and like that's just what it is right now. But yeah, man, in the meantime, between time, like, comment, subscribe, all that good shit, man. I appreciate y'all. I'm gonna just go ahead and just dive into it.
Today's episode is a very creepy and highly disturbing camping story. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is asleep, go to their front yard and spell the words "I hate my neighbors" in gasoline all across their front yard, and then light it on fire. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications.
That'd be funny. Them little like stories he be telling like before the story is like just a ball of fucking randomness on some shit. No pun intended. No pun intended, bruh. That's funny as heck though. Blood on the mountain.
Of May 6th, 2008, a 54-year-old man called Ricky Williams stood on the riverbank casting out his line into the waters of Dismal Creek in western Virginia. Ricky was hoping to get lucky and catch some trout, but he'd been out here fishing for 30 minutes so far, and there were no baits.
Not a real photo of Ricky's fishing line.
Because he loved just fishing for hours and hours at a time. But today, he and his dog, who was right with him, were really hungry, because they'd been out in these woods camping for several weeks now, and their food supply was finally dwindling down to the end. And so if they didn't catch any fish today, they might not eat. Now, for context, where Ricky was fishing, Dismal Creek, despite its bleak name, it was actually a beautiful, secluded spot on top of a mountain that was on the Appalachian Trail.
Ain't gonna lie, it looked like it.
You ain't lying. Very famous 2,200-mile-long trail that runs up and down the east coast of the United States. And why that is relevant is because there's this special code for people that hike on the Appalachian Trail. And the code, which all hikers know, is basically if you come across another hiker on the Appalachian Trail, it is your responsibility to help them if they need help. And it is their responsibility to help you if you need help. So it's this community of hikers that are always looking to help each other. So Ricky was very aware of this code on the Appalachian Trail, and he was secretly hoping, as he cast his line over and over again and didn't get any bites, that a hiker or a group of hikers might come by this area, and maybe they would see him and come down and learn that he needed food, and they might just give him some of their food. But another half hour passed and no hikers came by, and still Ricky could not catch any fish. But then suddenly, Ricky's dog, who was right next to him, began to whine and kind of began shifting around like it was sensing a predator in the area or something. But as Ricky was trying to calm his dog down, he began to hear a voice in the woods right behind him. Somebody was moving towards him. And when Ricky heard this voice, on the one hand, he was pretty excited, because maybe this is a hiker who can give him some food. But on the other hand, Ricky couldn't help but feel really uneasy. Now, you need to understand that Ricky was an older guy. He was kind of frail.
I feel that, bro. Like, you sometimes like get that feeling, bro. Like, I don't know if you've ever been like fishing, you know what I'm saying? But it rarely happens. And like that's how you know, like when it does happen, it's like, something's just not right, because it genuinely rarely happens. I've been fishing many times times like by myself, like early in the morning, night fishing or just evening fishing, and you're somewhere by yourself, you know what I'm saying, and it's like secluded, and you done found you a nice little fishing spot, a little pond, a little lake or something like that, but you just got like this eeriest feeling, bro, and it's like it looks so scenic and so peaceful and just right, but you got the eeriest feeling that like you're just being watched, and it's just like not like just like a, you know what I'm saying, I mean like you literally feel like you're being watched. I don't know, just, you know what I'm saying? That shit is unsettling as fuck.
You ain't lying. The past few weeks that he'd been camping with his dog, you know, as his food supply had run down, he had become skinnier and skinnier and skinnier, and so he really did not pose any sort of threat to anybody.
Damn.
He's like this weak older man. Now, generally speaking, the Appalachian Trail was a very safe place, but over the last few decades, there had actually been several murders that took place on the Appalachian Trail, and in fact, one of those killings took place less than 2 miles away from where Ricky was fishing with his dog. And in that double homicide, a very well-known killer named Randall Lee Smith had stabbed and shot to death 2 hikers. And so while Ricky was really looking for help from fellow hikers, at the same time,
not gonna lie,
help but feel somewhat apprehensive. Because again, Ricky was like this small, frail guy, and Ricky was well aware of these murders, and he was well aware of the fact that he was super close to one of the murder sites. And so Ricky was totally on edge as he's listening to this male voice get closer and closer, and then finally, this man in his early 30s steps out from the tree line, and he looks over and he sees Ricky, and for a second, the 2 men just kind of look at each other, but then this guy just grinned at Ricky and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And immediately, Ricky felt relieved, because he could tell just from looking at this guy that very likely he was not a threat. The man introduced himself as Scott Johnston, and he told Ricky he was actually camping in the area with a friend of his, and they were out here fishing, just like Ricky. And Ricky pretty much immediately said, "Oh, great, nice to meet you. Do you have any food for me?" And Scott was like, "Absolutely." And he dug into his bag that he had with him, and he pulled out a couple energy bars and chips, and he threw them over to Ricky. And he also gave some fresh bait to Ricky, so he too could cast out again.
Not a real photo of Scott's bait.
Scott and Ricky just stood on the riverbank and fished together. And after a while, the trout did start biting, and they did start catching fish. So the night kind of turned into a great outing for Ricky.
Right.
It got even better, because as soon as the men were done fishing, Scott asked Ricky if he wanted to join him and his friend back up at the campsite for dinner.
Oh, shit.
Remember, Ricky had no food, so this was an amazing invitation. And he said, "Yes, of course, I'd love to join you."
Crazy foreshadowing. Crazy foreshadowing. You know you hungry, and then somebody comes along, super inviting, super friendly and shit, and they're like, "Yeah, man, like come back, you know, come fry some fish, like we'll feed you, we'll take care." I don't know. The foreshadow is crazy right now.
2 men packed up their stuff right as the sun was going down, and then they began walking back into the forest where Scott had emerged from. And as they were walking, Scott's fishing pole got tangled on a low-hanging branch, and he was really struggling to get it out of the tree. And so finally, he just told Ricky to, you know, "Go on ahead. My campsite's right up there. It's a straight shot. Just go up the hill, and you'll see it." Ricky asked Scott if he was sure, and Scott said, "No, it's totally fine, go ahead." So Ricky said, "Okay," and he walked the rest of the way up the hill, and then when he walked out of the tree line into the clearing where Scott's campsite was, immediately what Ricky noticed was this enormous man who was like twice the size of Scott, and so 4 times the size of Ricky, kind of hunched over the campfire. And this huge man, who presumably was Scott's friend, he heard Ricky walk into the circle, and remember, it's nighttime, and they're kind of in the middle of nowhere, and so this guy, he turns his head around and sees this strange man just standing there, and Scott's nowhere to be found. And so this guy, he grabs a club, like a piece of wood, and he looks at Ricky kind of menacingly, like, "What are you doing here?" And Ricky, who was so caught off guard by just how big this guy was, put his hands up and he said, "I'm so sorry, Scott sent me up here. I don't know if this is the right site, I'm sorry." But just at that moment, Scott had finished untangling his fishing line, and he came out of the tree line, and he patted Ricky on the back, and he said, "Oh, you've already met my friend Sean." And as soon as he said that, Sean looked like he...
That's a big motherfucker right there.
He put the wood down, and he stopped glaring directly at Ricky. But Rick...
That's at least like a 400-pound nigga right there, bro. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I don't even gotta see his body. Like, you know, you can just look at a photo and just see the size of somebody, just like with the face, and it's like he looked like at least about a good like 345. You know what I'm saying? Ain't no telling how tall bro was either. At least by the solid like 345. You know what I'm saying? Like that's a large man. You know what I'm saying? Be walking up on in the middle of the night. Like I would have went ahead and just hey. You know what I'm saying? Like hey, just about to walk up. You know.
Felt like Sean was not happy that Ricky was in his campsite, even though clearly Scott is the reason that Ricky is in this campsite.
Yeah.
So Ricky just felt really uncomfortable, and at the same time, Scott is ushering Ricky closer to the campfire to take a seat next to Sean. You know, Sean's a great cook. He'll cook up this fish for us. It's going to be great. You know, take a seat. Ricky felt kind of annoyed that Scott was really forcing him to stay, but Ricky didn't want to be rude and just kind of abruptly leave, so he did take a seat next to Sean, who definitely was not excited to be sitting next to Ricky.
Right.
Ricky just kind of sat there waiting to see what would happen next. And what happened next is Scott walked over to Sean and handed off all the fish that he and Ricky had caught so that Sean could begin to prepare them, to cook them. And then as Ricky is still just sitting there right next to Sean, Scott walked away from the campfire up to his truck, which was parked right next to Sean's Jeep, and Scott turned on the radio and began blasting country music. And when Ricky heard this music, he kind of winced, because to him, you know, part of the reason the outdoors, the Appalachian Trail, you know, being out in nature, part of the reason it was so wonderful was for the peace and quiet. And so it felt kind of like borderline disrespectful to be out in the middle of this beautiful place, blaring country music. And so to Ricky, he just couldn't help
it depends on like how loud. You know what I'm saying?
about
He's saying
guys.
blaring
They
though.
seemed really disrespectful and kind of pushy and maybe aggressive. And so
Right.
Ricky is just not happy. But again, Ricky didn't say anything and didn't attempt to leave because, again, he's really hungry and so is his dog, and he needs to eat that fish. A moment later, Scott walked back from the truck and took a seat next to Sean, and then he, along with Sean, pulled out their knives and began deboning the fish. And as they were doing this, Ricky, again, is just kind of sitting there doing nothing, and so he kind of meagerly asked, you know, hey, can you give me a knife and I'll clean a fish? But Sean and Scott kind of waved him off and said, don't worry, we got this. And so Ricky just continued to sit there nervously as all he could watch.
Yeah, making no conversation or nothing like that. You feel me? Like,
but eventually, Scott and Sean finished deboning all the fish, and they put their knives away. And at that point, they began cooking the fish over the open flame. And suddenly for Ricky, it felt
That looked
like
good,
the mood
though.
had shifted a little bit. At least now the two men were not fiddling around with weapons. You know, it felt kind of safe again. And so Ricky began making some small talk in hopes that would kind of, you know, settle his nerves. And so Ricky told the two men about how much he loved the Appalachian Trail and how he came out here all the time for weeks at a time with his dog. And Ricky would tell the men that, you know, sometimes he felt more at home out in the wild than he did at home.
Right.
It was almost like being out in nature was a religious experience for Ricky.
Right.
He would even tell Sean and Scott that sometimes when he was out in nature, he would meditate and pray. And
It means something to him.
Like part of a ritual. I
Yeah.
mean, he was really trying to be in tune with Mother Nature. But as Ricky continued to tell Sean and Scott about his personal life, he noticed the two men were definitely paying attention and kind of nodding along at appropriate points in the story. But at
Right.
the same time, Ricky felt like these two men were also kind of looking at him like Ricky was kind of weird. As if they were not prepared to come out and say it, but after hearing all these things about his life, it was like, huh, what's going on with this guy? And so
Right.
Ricky suddenly felt really embarrassed about being so open with these two guys.
Just two
who, once again, just
polarizing
seemed like
worlds
they don't
on
like
some
him
shit.
Or even really want him here. But luckily, right at that moment, the fish were done, and so the men just sat there in silence and wolfed down the food. By the time they finished, right about 8 p.m., it was very dark outside, and Ricky at this point is just ready to go. You know, he just felt so uneasy here. And so after putting down his plate and his silverware and saying thank you to Sean and Scott for their hospitality, he quickly got up and grabbed his dog, and he began walking into the woods towards his campsite.
Right.
But after Ricky and his dog had walked maybe 10 or 15 feet away from this campsite, two things happened in rapid succession. Number one, Ricky suddenly stopped and turned around and looked back at the campsite. And number two, right as he did this, there was this enormous bang sound, like a small explosion that echoed through the forest. About 30 minutes later, and about 4 miles away from where Ricky and Sean and Scott had been, there were these two women who were in their house eating dinner when they heard this sudden frantic knocking on their front door.
Right.
Now, these women live in a very isolated part of the country.
Yeah.
So the women were very concerned. One of them rushed over to the phone just to be ready to call the police, while the other very carefully made their way towards the front of the house, and they kind of peered out the window, but they couldn't see anything outside. It was too dark, and so they went to their door, which was still getting pounded on by whoever was out there, and the woman, she unlocked the door, and she opened it just a crack, and what she saw nearly made her faint. There was a man standing on her porch who was absolutely covered in blood, as if he had been fully submerged in a tank of blood. I mean, he is all red. And the man had his hand over his neck. And the woman who opened the door, she looked at him and she saw that there was this rhythmic pulsing of blood pumping out of his neck.
Whoa.
That was in time with his heart. This man is clearly bleeding to death. And so the woman, she screamed for the other woman to please call 911. We have someone who's dying here. And so she began calling 911. And then the man on the porch just said, please help me. And then he said something about Dismal Creek. And then he collapsed. And this was so shocking for the woman who opened the door, and she just stood there staring, having no idea what to do. But then she happened to look up, and she noticed there was a Jeep that was idling out on the road in front of her house that she hadn't even registered until now. And so either this guy got dropped off, or he drove that Jeep. But before she could even begin to understand what had just happened, an ambulance and a whole bunch of police cars came screaming up and parked in front of her house. And then the medics got out, they rushed up, and they grabbed the bleeding man, and they put him in the ambulance, and they rushed him off.
Right.
Meanwhile, not far from the house, police officers were speeding towards Dismal Creek, because when the women called 911, they said, you know, this guy who's shown up on the porch bleeding said something about Dismal Creek, but they had no idea what it was about. And so instead of trying to wait to figure out what was even going on, police had basically said, let's just go to Dismal Creek and look around and see if we can figure out, you know, why someone would leave that area
Police
and show
Force.
up at this house covered in blood. But as the police were making their way up this winding mountain road, they saw a truck bombing down the road coming straight at them.
That's their ass right there.
Hit their brakes and did kind of attempt to get out of the way of the police cars, but after this truck had basically come to a stop, the driver of the truck just hit the gas all over again, and they veered wildly off the side of the road into an embankment, and they crashed and flipped several times, and then came to a stop. And the police officers who had veered to the side of the road to avoid getting hit by this truck, they just watched this happen, and they couldn't understand why the driver had gunned it again after stopping and then seemingly intentionally drove off the road. It almost seemed like the driver was trying to crash. And so the police, they got out of their car and they approached the wrecked truck with their guns drawn. But when they looked into the vehicle, they saw there was a single occupant, the driver, and he was still somehow alive. So the police got him out of the vehicle and they called an ambulance, but they actually sent an officer with the ambulance to escort them because the police were actually pretty suspicious of this truck driver.
Yeah, it's weird.
Remember, they were going up that road to get to Dismal Creek to see what had happened there that would lead to another man showing up on somebody's doorstep in the middle of the night covered in blood. And now they have this truck driver who looks like he's speeding away from Dismal Creek, who crashes his truck. I mean, there was no clear connection between the truck crash and the bloody guy, but the police were suspicious that they had to be connected. So they sent the officer to the hospital as well. About 30 minutes after the truck crash, the police left the scene and continued the rest of the way up the road to Dismal Creek. And once they got up there, the police fanned out all across the area and just began looking for anything. Just any clue that might explain what the heck happened here. If anything happened at Dismal Creek at all. And pretty quickly, the police actually did find something unique. In the middle of the Dismal Creek area, they found a campsite. But it was not the campsite where Sean and Scott were staying, where Ricky had gone and shared dinner with them. This was a different campsite. And not long after searching this other campsite, police concluded that whoever was staying here did not seem like they were mentally well. This seems like a mentally unstable and potentially dangerous person lives here. So the campsite was really simple. It was just a tent and a campfire. But when the police lifted up the flap and looked inside the tent, they found a collection of 30 knives along with a police scanner.
Hell nah, bro. This nigga got a fucking Joker arsenal full of knives all laid out and sprawled out across the floor and shit. Like, hell nah, my boy. And so All of that happens. He gets the weird feeling. He hears the bang. And then we fast forward to, we don't know who this guy is. I'm suspecting that's his bro who was needing the food. I forget his name. But I'm suspecting it's him that knocked on the door that was holding his neck. I'm just like, bro, what the fuck, bro? Like, imagine somebody coming up to your door, like, neck sliced, fucking protruding blood and shit, you know? And it's just like, bro, like that's like too much for like the brain to comprehend in just like one, like, you feel me? Like, sheesh.
Police radio chatter in the area, so you could listen to a scanner and basically know what the police were doing in your area. There were also all these weird piles of clothing. Some were for kids, some were for adults, some were for men, some were for women. There were
see the kid clothing,
and there were 8 pairs of women's underwear. And then also there was a map of the Appalachian Trail inside of this tent, and all over this map along the trail were all these spots that were circled, but there was no information about what these circles meant. However, one of the places that was circled was Dismal Creek. And then next to the map was a radio, and inside the radio was a cassette. And so the police just hit play, and immediately what they heard totally creeped them out, because the tape sounded like some kind of satanic ritual. It was basically this one man's voice just kind of howling and chanting over and over again. But by far, the most shocking thing that was found inside of that tent was a single piece of paper. And this piece of paper was a birth certificate, and the name on the birth certificate was a name that basically all police in this area knew, and in fact, anybody living in or around the Appalachian Trail definitely would know this name.
Yeah.
And the identity of this person, the name on the birth certificate, was the key to putting together all these seemingly disconnected events that had happened on this night.
Yeah.
From the explosion when Ricky walked away from the fire,
right,
to the bloody man at the house, to the truck crash, they were all connected through this single person. A few hours earlier, after Ricky had gotten up and walked away from Sean and Scott's campsite, and then after barely making it onto the trail, he had turned around and there was that loud explosion. Well, at that point in the story, Ricky, who's now looking back at the campsite and looking at Sean and Scott, he can see that the two of them, they've heard the sound too, and they were now staring at each other with looks of absolute shock and terror on their faces.
Right.
Then Ricky watched as Sean reached up and touched his face, and he put his hand out in front of his face, and it was covered in red. And the reason for that was because Sean had just been shot in the face, because that loud explosion was the sound of Ricky shooting his gun at Sean. And as Sean and Scott stood there staring at each other in absolute disbelief, Ricky, who's still in the tree line, ran towards the fire and just kept on shooting. And so Sean, at this point, as he sees Ricky coming into the campsite, he stands up and kind of staggers back and falls on the ground. But Scott, who's not hurt at this point, he just gets up and starts running away from the campsite, and Ricky turns his attention towards Scott, and he shoots at him, and he hits him straight in the neck and also in the back.
Damn!
But somehow Scott just kept on running despite these horrible wounds, and so Ricky watched as Scott disappeared into the woods, and then Ricky turned back to Sean, who's laying on the ground and can't go anywhere. He's been shot in the face, and Ricky just casually raised his gun and shot Sean right in the chest. But amazingly, Sean, after getting shot the second time, it created what must have been the most extreme adrenaline rush ever, because he jumped up to his feet, and right in front of his attacker, he just turned and sprinted to his Jeep. He hopped inside, fired it up, and just sped away as fast as he could. And when Sean flipped on his headlights and turned a corner after getting away from the campsite, he looked down the road and he actually saw his buddy, Scott, who had run away first, come tumbling out of the woods onto the road. And so Sean, who's gravely injured, drives over next to Scott, and he stops the Jeep long enough for Scott to climb inside, and they shut the door and they speed their way towards the nearest help, which happened to be that house where those two women lived. And so it was Scott, who looked like he was drenched in blood, who knocked on the women's door.
Bro, it was Ricky the whole time, gang. Ricky! I was not expecting that, bro. I'm like, damn, I'm thinking, because that's like a big dude. I'm like, damn, what they about to do to this dude? And bro just went fucking American Psycho, bro, in the woods, in the Appalachian Mountains, gang.
Because it's not just about the pleasures of conformity and the importance of trends, it's also a personal statement about the band itself. Hey, Paul! Ah!
Yo, I was not expecting that to happen, bro. I like that. That shit got me lost for words. I'm like, this man really just went off. That's why you can't trust everybody, man, especially out there.
He was down in the Jeep out on the road, but he was just too weak to get out and come up to the door as well. But when the ambulance and police arrived, they would find not only Scott up on the porch, but also Sean in the Jeep, and both men would be taken to the hospital via helicopter. And then as for the man who was driving the truck down the road away from Dismal Creek,
right,
and crashed right in front of the police, well, the driver of that truck was Ricky Williams. However, that was not his real name. There was no Ricky Williams. That was the name he just used.
Right.
His real name, which was on the birth certificate that police found in that other campsite inside of the tent, was Randall Lee Smith. The same infamous Randall Lee Smith who had murdered those two hikers not far from Dismal Creek. That double homicide had happened in 1981, and Randall was...
I almost forgot about the damn murderer.
But he was paroled 15 years later in 1996 for good behavior. And
look at this nigga. Look at this nigga. Look at his eyes, bro. Look how they're like devoid. They're almost just like black. You know what I'm saying? Like, and a lot of serial killers be having them, like the Ted Bundys and the John Wayne Gacy's. They all look devoid of like life when you look in their eyes on some shit, which is like the eeriest fucking feeling, high key. But this goofball looking ass, like, look at this nigga right here though, bro. Like, that's crazy. So he did this as an old man, or was like, oh, let me see.
10 years after that, Randall lived with his mother and he wore this electronic bracelet, and he followed the rules. But by 2008, his electronic bracelet had came off, and even though Randall had attempted to continue living with his mother, it just wasn't tenable. He didn't have enough money, and so ultimately he packed up his things, grabbed his dog, and moved out onto the Appalachian Trail. And on May 6th, 2008, when Sean and Scott arrived in Dismal Creek to go fishing, Randall was waiting. Nobody has any idea why Randall murdered those two hikers back in 1981 or why he targeted Sean and Scott in 2008. All we know is that Randall Lee Smith was very mentally unwell and very likely viewed the Appalachian Trail as like his sacred place. And so maybe, he felt like Sean and Scott had somehow disrespected the Appalachian Trail, and that was enough to attack them.
Damn.
Now, we know Sean and Scott
That's
did
crazy.
not do anything intentionally disrespectful to Randall, because, amazingly, Sean and Scott survived this attack. And they would say that when they saw Randall, they just felt bad for him. They thought he was like this alcoholic drifter who didn't have a home of his own, and so he was just living out in the woods on the Appalachian Trail.
Right.
They didn't judge him. Instead, they really did just want to give him some food and spend some time with him. And
send him about his way.
That was it. And because Randall appeared to be this kind of small, older man, Sean and Scott, who were, very
look
big and
how
imposing,
crazy
so
this
threatened by
nigga
guy.
looks.
As for that bizarre other campsite that police found up around Dismal Creek, the one that contained all those knives and the birth certificate, well, obviously, that was Randall's campsite. And that weird cassette tape that they listened to that sounded like a satanic ritual, that was Randall going through his meditations and chants that he would do when he was out in the middle of nowhere. It was like his way of respecting Mother Nature and the Appalachian Trail. And then all those items that were found inside of his tent, the different clothes. And
bro over here doing demonic chants and recording it, and the way he was like explaining it, like when he had the way he was like explaining it when he was at the campfire and shit, like, oh, like I just love nature and I just love to meditate out here and I appreciate nature for what it is, blase, blase, blase. And this nigga out here doing some satanic meditation ritual shit in the Appalachian Mountains. That's crazy, mud. Man, say, bro, folks be.
It's believed those could be Randall's other victims. However, when police pulled DNA samples from all of those items that were found inside of his tent, like the clothes and the underwear and the eyeglasses, well, those DNA samples did not match any of the missing people or murder victims in the police's database.
Even weirder.
So that wasn't useful. And then also, police went to all those places on that map that were circled, and with the exception of obviously Dismal Creek, they didn't find anything else at the other locations that suggested any violent event had happened there. So only Randall knows the truth, which means we will never know the truth, because just 4 days after Randall was pulled out of that truck that he crashed, he died in police custody from a blood clot that formed as a result of the crash. And in those 4 days,
Crazy how God work, man. I'm telling you, that's crazy how he worked. Died from a blood clot that he got in the crash. That's crazy how that worked. He done did all of this for all these years, been like killing folks in these woods, and that's exactly what got his ass killed. Him swerving out the way of the police, driving into the ditch. Fast forward, and they get a damn blood clot.
You shouldn't have been talking shit.
Randall was in custody, he never gave up that there were any other victims. Today, Sean still has a bullet in his head and in his chest. And
Damn!
Scott still has deep scarring on his neck and on his back. But both men have made a full recovery, relatively speaking, and they still go back to Dismal Creek all the time to go camping and fishing.
God bless him. God bless him. Going back to Dismal Creek though will be a little traumatizing. They probably got that mental fortitude there where it's just like you done been to a spot enough to know where it's like, that's crazy that this one crazy thing happens here. As long as I've been coming here, as long as we've been coming here, then this one crazy ass thing happens. You know what I'm saying? But it was just like, shit, that was that one time out of like the millions of times that we done been here and like we run across this crazy ass nigga. You feel me? But kudos to them, bro, for still being able to going back and for making a full recovery.
That's what I think.
And for the Lord just blessing them just to be alright and making it through that. Still got the bullet in his chest and in his head.
Damn.
Shit. That's fucking, give me the fucking heebie-jeebies, bro. Then bro just got a fucking seal size, like $150 across the neck. Like, good Lord. Yeah, man, that was a damn good story, bro. Like, no cap, that was a damn good story. And that was such a plot twist at the end of that shit, bro. Cause I was expecting a typical, but bro done flipped the script and just popped him again. Shoot other dude in the fucking neck while he running. They make it to a lady's house, bleeding profusely. Man, that's a crazy fucking story. Then the dude runs from the cops, crashes his car, gets caught, and dies of a blood clot due to the crash.
Damn.
That's OD, mud. I'm gonna have to check out some more of these. For sure. I'm gonna have to check out some more of these. I'm gonna have some more of these on the way. Even me just going through his, like, you know what I'm saying, just looking through his archive, I'm like, yeah, this is a lot of good shit in here to react to. So we're gonna be diving into some Mr. Ballin' too, you know what I'm saying? We got the Outdoor Boys, so we're gonna be diving into some Mr. Ballin'. Then in between then, I'm gonna be posting like my actual gaming gameplay in my shorts and the longer forms in my videos as well. But like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, bro, and I'm gonna holla at y'all, man, till next time.
Say, got me coming off the muscle like a rope. Yeah, it's Gemini and Rory, we ain't never needed help with making hits. A bad and average in itself is probably 400. Smoking out the pack, I got the trap house in Oklahoma City, bro.